15, 20, but I don't really believe in it anymore. I do think now that Aristotle is basically describing two distinct possible developmental trajectories. And now I'm talking about people who have any chance of becoming virtuous. I'm not talking about the hopeless cases, those who are really brought up in bad habits. But for those who have any chance of becoming virtuous, I think it does describe two developmental lines or trajectories. One for those who are really fortunate, good parents and good friends. They follow the plan A, the upper level, which is sort of very effortless and painless. Just gradually you're habituated first into the moral virtues, and then gradually at some point in time you start to seek them as well yourself. So they're not only taught or caught, they're also sought by the person. And this person is really lucky because this person is like the one who enjoys eating vegetables. You don't have to force yourself to eat them. You like it. You enjoy you enjoy developing the virtues because it gives you pleasure. And the lower level plan B is for those who are less fortunate, not as well brought up, but still feel a sense of wanting to be good, and they have to force themselves to a number of different stages. First, sort of lack of self-regulation or incontinence, and then towards self-regulation or continence. And then obviously you can move between these two levels. So I think this is basically the Aristotelian theory of moral development, but it doesn't really matter whether you follow line A or line B, the upper or upper or lower level. At some point in time, you need to start to seek the virtues yourself. And obviously, as we know, Aristotle is extremely sort of demanding in that respect. He says that people who just do the good when they have become adults because they are following somebody else's lead or doing like somebody else told you or taught you, that doesn't really have any moral value anymore if it's not chosen by you in a critical way. So Phronesis really plays an extremely important part there in that part of moral development where you start to seek the virtues. So why is it important to try to cultivate phronesis at school? Well, I think everybody agrees that character education is about the ability to make wise choices. And it's very difficult nowadays, at least, to sort of keep this in abeyance until early adulthood, because people are making very significant choices at a younger and younger age that can have significant implications for their future. So young people, for example, are posting things on social media when they're 10 or 11 or 12 that can have implications for their well-being later on in life. So I think probably we need to start to cultivate this self-reflection and critical thinking, this excellence in moral deliberation earlier than maybe used to be the case. And from an academic point of view, phronesis also holds out some prospect of solving the infamous gappiness problem in moral psychology. So the gappiness problem is sort of maybe one of the most discussed issues in contemporary moral psychology since Kohlberg's time. So in the 1970s and early 80s, people were fairly optimistic in moral psychology about how to bridge the gap between knowing the good and doing the good, because according to Kohlberg, that is all based on moral knowledge and moral reasoning. So if you manage to enter the higher stages of moral reasoning, then you will be making good choices and doing the right thing, because if you know the good, why wouldn't you do the good? Now, unfortunately, Augusto Blasi's 1980 meta-analysis indicated that the correlations between moral reasoning stages and actual moral decision-making is only 0.2 or 20%. So this was a big shock, obviously, for the Kohlbergian, credo or monopoly in moral psychology. I mean, Kohlberg was the undisputed king of moral psychology in those days. And since then, moral psychologists have been sort of running around like headless chicken, trying to find some other solutions to what it is then that bridges the gap between knowing the good and doing the good. And we have these two main alternative explanations. One is that it's moral identity, it's the formation of an image of who you want to be. It's usually then happens around sort of early teenagehood. And then you start to take decisions with that moral identity in mind. So this is obviously the Augusto Blasi's own hypothesis, and other famous moral psychologists like Larry Walker have also promoted this idea. But again, empirical research seems to indicate that correlations between moral identity and moral decision making are also around 0.2, 20%. And then finally, we've got people like Hoffman who believe that actually the real motivation doesn't come from reasoning or identity formation, it comes from emotions like empathy and compassion. And those are the ones that bridge the gap between knowing the good and doing the good. So we've got this, but again, it's really, really funny that empirical research again seems to indicate a correlation of 0.2. So we've got 20% of the explanation from each of these three factors, but still the question remains, I mean, is there any way to synergize these three factors? Is there any umbrella concepts that might sort of incorporate them and sort of explain moral decision making above and beyond these three? And that is the hypothesis that we've been working with in the Jubilee Center, whether phronesis is possibly the bridge builder between knowing the good and doing the good, and incorporating actually items from reasoning, identity, and emotions. So if this is such an important concept, why is there so little written about it in sort of practical moral education and character education? It's not a huge topic so far, not compared to many other topics like habituation or role modeling, etc. So I think there are a number of reasons for that. First of all is the fact that there is this ongoing debate among Aristotelian scholars about exactly when and how phronesis is cultivated. And there is this ongoing debate still among between Nancy Sherman. I think Nancy Sherman's interpretation of Aristotle is very appealing, but I don't think it has much basis in what Aristotle himself says, unfortunately. It's very rhapsodic, but it's appealing. So her view is that we need to start to train phronesis from basically from the time a child really starts to understand any language or understand any reasoning. So just with a toddler, we need to start to reason with the toddler and just develop the toddler into a reasoning agent. Yeah. So her focus is on the preschool level and the elementary school. Whereas Berniet's interpretation of Aristotle indicates that there are two completely distinct phases of development. You begin with the habituation phase only, the carrot and the stick, and then at some point in time, there's a transition towards this critical reflection of which phronesis includes. But if that is true, then we end up with what Richard Peters called the paradox of moral education. I mean, how can you habituate someone into being an autonomous agent? It's a bit like a German friend I used to have when I was at university who once said to me, I think we should plan to do something spontaneous tonight. So that's sort of paradoxical in a way. And then another reason is that actually most of the character education practical literature, and this also applies in many ways to moral psychology, is about younger students. It's a lot about sort of primary school, early high school level students. And it's much easier to design interventions using simple methods like service learning or role modeling. And it's much easier to focus on the development of individual virtues, avoiding conflict scenarios. So it's very easy for a teacher to come up with a simple, for example, gratitude exercise with kids, which does, show results. So we know that gratitude exercises, gratitude letters, gratitude diaries, and so on, do show results on standard sort of moral development tests. And it's much easier to do that and to avoid conflict scenarios where, for example, there's a conflict between your loyalty to your friends when you are a young student, and honestly, you need to tell the truth about something that the friends did which was wrong. And then obviously, finally, like I said before, Aristotle is not very clear himself about when and how phronesis is to be cultivated. So most of what he says about that is just platitudes. He says that phronesis is cultivated through teaching and experience, but he doesn't tell us what kind of teaching or what kind of experience. So most of the work that we've done in the Jubilee Center regarding phronesis, at least until recently, was fairly practical and mainly geared at young professionals or young students of professional ethics. It's not until recently that we've started to think about phronesis development and with younger students, and also sort of go more deeply into the philosophy behind it. So we conducted a number of research projects with professionals, so medical doctors, nurses, army officers, police officers, teachers, etc. Interviews and surveys, and also with students. And the common complaint we got was a very, very serious complaint about the content of the professional ethics courses that these students do at university. So a standard complaint, I think I can sort of describe it by describing an interview I did with a young medical doctor, and she told me that she did a medical ethics course at university, and she said there was a lot of abstract concepts introduced, like informed consent, very long introductions into code books and rule books, codes of conduct. So the abstract upper level was great, and then there was also a lot of really sort of down-to-earth practical advice about good bedside manners and how to speak to patients and so on. But what was missing, she said, completely was the middle level, the level of all the conflicts and dilemmas that doctors meet with on a daily basis in the operating theater in a DP practice. There was no phronesis taught there. There was no sort of, and what she called for, she wanted the teachers of ethics to bring in experienced medical doctors to talk about these dilemmas and enter into a dialogue about them. So she put it in a very nice way that she said the moral middle is squeezed out in these ethics courses. And we got a very similar response from the teachers and the lawyers and the business people and the police officers and so on. So one of the reasons why we began to focus on phronesis in the context of professional ethics is that actually, if you look at the phronesis literature in the last 30 years, and there obviously has been a bandwagon phronesis writings after that sort of fairly silent 20th century. Most of that, I would say 70–80% of those writings are in the field of professional ethics. So there's a huge amount of papers published almost every month in business ethics, nursing ethics, medical ethics, etc., about phronesis. Obviously, there has also been a reawakening of interest in philosophy and psychology, and we've got some of the representatives of that interest with us today, actually, in this seminar. But still, the greatest majority of writings is in professional ethics. And there is one thing which is really important for you to sort of bear in mind regarding that interest, that the concept of phronesis that's being discussed in professional ethics is not the Aristotelian concept, and it's not even the neo-Aristotelian concept that I will be talking to you about in more detail later. So there are actually two concepts of phronesis which are dominant in the professional ethics literature. One is a Markantarian concept of practical wisdom, about where practical wisdom is considered to be excellence in deliberation within practices. But practices do not need to be moral practices. It's not the Aristotelian notion of praxis as the sort of sphere of phronesis. So, for example, the issues that are being dealt with in the medical ethics literature regarding phronesis is the phronesis of the cancer consultant who needs to give an individual patient a mixture of cancer drugs. And there is no rule book for this. You have to think about the patient's history and individuality and you know, family history and emotional life, and there are all these things you take into consideration. And this is what medical ethics talks about in the context of Phronesis and draws on McIntyre. But this is obviously not Aristotle's concept. I mean, Aristotle thought of medicine in this way as techne, not Phronesis. The other concept, which is even further away from Aristotle, is a postmodern concept of Phronesis, according to which Phronesis is some kind of mysterious, intuitive artistry, which doesn't really sort of have any realist or any objective grounding to it. It's some kind of, like I said, it's having some kind of an eye for things. And again, that is very, very far away from Aristotle's moral realism and his view that there is a ruling science, as he puts it. Phronesis has a ruling science behind it, although it's uncodifiable in practice, but it's not uncodifiable in theory. It's just uncodifiable in practice because the world is simply too complex. But according to the postmodern concept of Phronesis, Phronesis is in principle uncodifiable. So unfortunately, this abundant literature is not of huge interest for people who sort of study Aristotle or are interested in the Aristotelian concept. And then to make things even worse, I mean, despite all this literature, before 2019, there was no sort of clear conceptualization of Phronesis and no measure available either. So what we have been trying to do in the Jubilee Center is to come up with a neo-Aristotelian model of Phronesis. And we are not the only ones. Howard Cursor has been doing the same thing. Dan Russell did the same thing in his 2029 book. And then Nancy Snow and her colleagues have been doing something similar as well in the new book. And Christian Miller says that these are all examples of what he calls the neo-Aristotelian standard model of Phronesis. Now, I don't really know whether standard model is a very good term because there are quite a big differences between the way we, Russell, Cursor, and Snow sort of conceptualize it, but they do have certain things in common though. So, and some of the differences are more terminological. But anyway, just to give you an example of how we do it, I mean, our view is that Phronesis has a number of different components and each component performs a certain function and these functions are interrelated and they amplify each other. So it's not just an umbrella concept for different functions. It's a concept that sort of shows a synergy between these four. So we call them the constitutive function or moral sensitivity, the ability to identify a moral problem. The blueprint function is having some kind of moral identity or idea about human flourishing, what you're aiming for in life in general. Then there's emotion regulation, infusing your emotions with reason so that they don't upset your decision-making process. And then finally, the ability to solve conflicts by reasoning about the right decision. So this is basically the model of Phronesis that we are working with and trying to sort of come up with interventions that strengthen these different components in young people. So just to give an example, a very practical example, just to take one of the standard cases from Barry Schwartz's original book about practical wisdom, this standard case of your best friend coming to you and asking you what you think about the new dress he has bought for the party tonight, and you think the dress looks awful, but you are a very compassionate person, you're also a very honest person, you want to tell the truth, but you're also very compassionate, and you know this friend has been going through a tough time, a divorce and things, and she might not be able to stand being told that the dress looks ugly, she doesn't have time to buy a new one, etc. So what happens according to this model is that, I mean, first you identify that there is a problem and you identify which are the virtues that are at stake here, in this case, like honesty and compassion. And unfortunately, many young people fail at this first stage. When we give them moral dilemmas or show them video clips, they just are not able to identify what is the problem. So the constitutive function is not working. Now, secondly, you need to have some kind of blueprint of the good life. What kind of a person do you want to be? I mean, in your relationship with this friend and other friends, what is your aim in life in general regarding your moral decisions? And then obviously you have to try to control your emotions. If your emotion of compassion is so strong that it sort of, with this friend, that it sort of overcomes or rules out other emotions, then you have to be able to regulate that. And then finally, you have to be able to deliberate well and reach some kind of a decision about what you are going to do. Is it possible to give an answer that is indicative of honest compassion or compassionate honesty, or do you have to just choose one of the virtues there and completely ditch the other one? So what we are doing at the moment, and I will say very little about this because this paper is still under construction and I need to keep the powder dry. So we've done a fairly big study with 16-year-old high school students and 18-year-old first-year university students, where we give them moral dilemmas, and we check all these 4 factors by using a battery of some old and some new psychological instruments. And then what we are trying to figure out, and then we sort of ask them how they would react in the situation and why. And what we are trying to figure out is whether phronesis predicts or explains their decision-making above and beyond the 4 components individually. And then, of course, we also control for things like the big 5. Now, there are no numbers on this because we are sort of still keeping them secret, but I can sort of tell you as a spoiler that our findings are extremely positive and much more positive than I have possibly been able to dream of. So actually, phronesis does seem to explain prosocial or moral behavior above and beyond just these 4 components. So there is some hope that actually, yes, it might be the case that phronesis bridges the gap between moral knowledge and moral action. And this is the sort of the most recent way that we sort of formulate the model or describe the model. So as you can see, the 4 components, they are all interrelated. And obviously I can say more about this later if you want. So on a practical note, again, before I sort of end on a more philosophical note later, but just on a practical note, after we did this research, I mean, the next step was for us to actually craft an intervention. I mean, yeah, it's nice to know that phronesis, the construct of phronesis, does seem to predict moral behavior, but is it possible to change this? Is it possible to develop this with students? And we crafted a very nice intervention, I believe, but unfortunately we started twice in 2020 and 2021, and in both cases, after 1 week, the school was closed because of COVID. So unfortunately, we were not able to finish it, and I'm really not sure when we will be able to do that now, because actually that particular project has come to an end. The funding for that project has come to an end. But actually, what the intervention just consisted in real life dilemmas, reflection, discussion, and adjudication with questions like what emotions is the protagonist feeling, what exactly is the problem, what are the options, what are the pros and cons of each option, and what advice would you give the protagonist and why. And we deliberately chose stories with third persons because, as you may know, Igor Grossman's research into wisdom interventions indicates that at the beginning, at least, people are much more capable of figuring out the wise thing to do for the third person through self-distancing rather than stories that involve yourself. So these are very exciting times, obviously. Like I said, until recently, the big boom in phronesis research was in professional ethics, but not about the neo-Aristotelian concept. But now, obviously, we've got this huge surge in interest in psychology and philosophy in just the last 2 or 3 years. And maybe the most significant development is the new wisdom model by Igor Grossman and colleagues So as you may know, I mean, Igor, he gathered together a kind of a world-leading team of psychological experts on what they call wisdom in psychology. People who have been writing about this but disagreeing about fundamentals, and then they came together and as a task force and wrote a paper about what they call the common model or consensual model of wisdom. And there's a whole issue of psychological inquiry, Second Issue 2020, about that. And this work is ongoing. So I am participating in a seminar with him on Monday, actually, where he's bringing these experts together again to finesse the model. Now, obviously, this is not a Phronesis model. This is still more a model of wise thinking than wise decision making, but it does move the wisdom discourse in psychology considerably closer to Phronesis, because they are trying to develop a model of what they call practical wisdom, and move the wisdom discourse in psychology away from Sophia or theoretical wisdom, and also from mere calculation. So this is, yeah, the difference between the wisdom literature in psychology and the Phronesis literature has been substantially reduced through this new wisdom model. And then, of course, we've got a lot of general writings about character and virtue in psychology, touching upon Phronesis, like the overview paper by Lane Fowers in Perspectives on Psychological Science. And then, obviously, we have the new Routledge volume with some excellent contributions, many of them quite critical, Christian Miller, Lapsley, etc., where the Aristotelian construct is criticized both for either for being too narrow or too broad. And then there's an endless stream of articles in educational philosophy as well, but unfortunately most of them are fairly derivative, just sort of going through Aristotle's text again and again and trying to figure out some new details. So all this is fairly promising, but I mean, the problem we face in the Jubilee Center is this is not an easy concept to explain to teachers, parents, and students. I was just having a long meeting on Wednesday with grantees who've been given grants in the States at various universities, teacher training universities in the States to develop virtue and Phronesis in teacher trainees. And I found it really, really difficult to sort of get my message across to those people who didn't know anything. I mean, who had no idea what Phronesis was. You have to start at a very, very low level, and just it's quite difficult to explain all the basics. And some of the questions I got at the end sort of left me in complete sort of frustration about what I had been doing. And then, of course, some of the individual components of our model might be difficult to justify or explain, and especially the blueprint component. And indeed, that's the component that Nancy Snow is most critical of. So the main difference between Nancy Snow's model and the model that we've been developing in the Jubilee Center is that her conception of the blueprint of the moral identity is much more vague than ours, and she doesn't really think that we can sell a blueprint of the good life to a liberal audience. And then there's a question of how do we craft the interventions and how do we measure the effectiveness of those interventions. Obviously, we hope that if this measure that we developed is as good as it seems to be from the original research, then we might be able to use that for pre and post tests, but we haven't been able to do that yet. So we are starting some work on an intervention for police officers, Phronesis intervention, where we will be using this measure for pre and post testing. So what's in the pipelines? Well, the original Phronesis project has ended. So now we are working on a professional project, mainly with the police in the UK. And you may have heard about all the recent scandals, which are shaking the foundations of police ethics in the UK. And so probably the first formal intervention that we try will not be with high school students as we planned originally, but with police officers. And then there's also another project which I'm not directly involved in, which is about cyber phronesis or cyber wisdom. So how does phronesis play out in the teaching of subjects like IT? And phronesis is meant to permeate all work done in the Jubilee Center in the last 3 years. So we need to be able to walk the walk. Right, so I will end on a slightly more philosophical note after this sort of all these practical slides by talking a little bit about collective phronesis. So almost all the discourse about phronesis, which is Aristotelian, is based on what Aristotle says about phronesis in the Nicomachean Ethics. But he talks about phronesis as meta virtue, helping with the deliberation and arbitration of individual moral virtues. But very few people have written about Aristotle's view of phronesis in the politics, although he does talk about it quite a lot there as well. In the context of the civic virtues, as they are usually called, although obviously he doesn't call them civic, he just calls them political, but anyway, political virtues. Obviously, Aristotle doesn't really have any concept of moral either, so he doesn't talk about moral virtues, he talks about ethical virtues. But I'm just using civic and moral here because that's the standard way people use these terms nowadays, although the correct Aristotelian translations would be ethical virtues versus political virtues. So what he says about the political or civic virtues in the politics is really interesting because he sort of depicts various levels of political virtues in the politics. And the two lowest levels of political virtue in the politics do not require phronesis at all. So that's a huge difference between the political virtues and the moral virtues. So he says that everybody, every citizen should be able to internalize the basic civic virtues. And that includes obviously all the great majority of people who don't have phronesis. On the other hand, the two higher levels of civic virtues in the politics, they're only for rulers of states, and they sort of include obviously phronesis. He says that nobody should be a ruler without phronesis anyway. So it's really, really strange. And also in the politics, he doesn't think that the civic virtues are going to come with the benefit of any pleasure necessarily. So the discussion of the civic virtues and the use of phronesis for civic virtues is very, very different from the discussion of phronesis versus the moral virtues in the Nicomachean Ethics. Now, I think actually the wrong people have been sort of studying the politics in a way. I mean, it's mainly studied by people interested in political philosophy and political science, but actually he's talking about states, most of which, apart from Athens and Sparta, only had 1,000 people or less. So, yeah, he talks about what was it, 250 states, different states. And so actually what he says in the politics is much more relevant to contemporary business ethics than it is to sort of political theory, because these states resemble much more like institutions like hospitals or universities rather than sort of modern states. And actually the father of virtue-based business ethics, Bob Solomon, I mean, he picked this up. I mean, he's one of the few people who pointed out that actually business ethicists should be reading the politics. Now, like I said, I mean, there's a huge lacuna in the literature there. But everybody is writing about individual phronesis as a capacity of an individual to take good decisions. But in the politics, it's all about collective phronesis. And apart from one obscure Japanese business scholar called Nonaka, who has picked this up and written about this, I mean, it's just not mentioned at all in the business ethics literature or in the philosophy and psychology literatures. Although it's really it could be well connected to recent discussions about the wisdom of crowds and collective intelligence and so on. There is there is a large literature in philosophy, although it's a bit niche and non-mainstream. There's a fairly large literature on the contribution of Aristotle's observations about collective phronesis to the idea of deliberative democracy. But I also think people are barking up the wrong tree there. I think what Aristotle says about collective phronesis in the politics has very, very little relevance to democratic theory. It has much more relevance to, for example, the running of a small firm or a business company. So this is the famous passage that everybody writes about in the politics about collective phronesis. I'll just read it out. For it's possible that the multitude, though not individually virtuous, yet when they come together may be better not individually but collectively than those who are so. Just as public dinners to which many contribute are better than those supplied at one man's cost. For where there are many, each individual, it may be argued, has some portion of virtue and phronesis. And when they come together, just as the multitude becomes a single man with many feet and many hands and many senses, so also it becomes one personality as regards character and thought. And later on in the politics, he says that the many are less corruptible than the few and also less likely to fall prey at the same time to one single overbearing passion like anger. So when philosophers write about this, they do so almost entirely in the context, like I said, of political philosophy and especially the theory of deliberative democracy. I think, like I said, this whole literature is slightly misguided because what Aristotle is talking about is the accumulation and synergies of phronesis, but most people in a democracy never develop it. So he's not talking about, a democratic community of people where everybody takes part in the decision procedure at all. And this is written in the context of figuring out how best to rule a state by people who are already reasonably developed phronimon. So as I read the accumulation argument, it simply states that it's beneficial for an organizational entity to have relatively many people who are already developing or mature phronimoi coming together to manage it. The reason is that all real-life phronimoi are fallible, and in collating the intellectual and experiential resources, the benefits of collective phronesis are activated. And this is something which should really resonate with, contemporary management theory, because we know that, most significant decisions at the management and business level nowadays are taken by collectives, by a group of CEOs. They're not taken by an individual person. And in other words, the accumulation argument, as I read it, is exclusively about the pros and cons of collective phronesis for good management of a state or a small entity. It's not about the pros and cons of deliberative democratic practices, more broadly speaking, because obviously Aristotle, he talks about democracy as a perverted form of government. He's not interested in democracy and democratic theory at all. So I find it really, really strange why this discussion of phronesis there is usually only sort of brought in or brought to bear on democratic theory. But anyway, I think this is a very fertile ground for philosophers, psychologists, and not least business ethicists to look at. And obviously for somebody trying to come up with a grand theory of phronesis, like the Neo-Aristotelian theory or like the theory that Mario and Maria have been coming up with and so on. I think it's sort of incomplete unless you also take account of these various references to phronesis in the politics, in the context of arbitration between civic or political virtues. So this is sort of my last contribution. As I said, there's been a lot of recent writings about phronesis, which are extremely helpful. I still think the original book by Schwartz and Sharp is the best reading for somebody who doesn't know anything about this. that work on practical wisdom. It's especially for people within professional ethics, because Schwartz and Sharp are working with the Aristotelian concept of phronesis, not the McIntyrean concept or a postmodern concept. And they take a lot of nice examples. This is not really an academic book; it's more like a trade book. But I don't think anything I have ever written or anybody else in philosophy or psychology, even when we try to be very down to earth and practical, I don't think any of us has managed to write as clearly about this as Schwartz and Sharp. And it's also a really nice deconstruction of deontology in professional ethics and the failure of professional codes or practice to help people take good decisions. And then obviously for those who want to go into the heavier stuff, I mean, there's a lot of recent writings in philosophy and psychology relevant to phronesis. And I'm sure a lot more is coming out in the next few years, for example, inspired by the recent Routledge volume, which really gives a very nice picture of the lie of the land in contemporary theorizing. So I think I've spoken for 49 minutes exactly. So I think I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Really. Thank you so much for this stimulating talk. Let me just say that I believe this idea of explaining and illustrating phronesis or phronesis in such a comprehensive picture is really valuable and extensive also, because actually these 4 components you have illustrated, in my view, do not just apply, but they really embody phronesis into the different fields of human experience. Really, I think that this proposal advances research on this important virtue. So now we can open our discussion. You are perfectly on time, so thank you also for that. And we have half an hour for discussion. So please, if you want to raise your hands, Marius first, and then let me see if there's someone else after him. Okay. So let's start with these 2 questions. First, Mario, and after Mario, Sofia. Sorry, I have to unmute you. Just a minute.
Yeah, no, I could, because I'm still one of the many co-organizers. So thank you very much, Kristján. That was enlightening in many respects. Your idea of the wrong characterizations of phronesis, the McIntyrean and the postmodernists, for example, is very useful. But the many connections also you did with fields that are expanding. The idea of studying collective phronesis, for example, is very interesting and could be connected with the racing studies about collective intentionality, social ontology. There is a big group there working on this issue. So I think that's, I will talk with our Italian group, but we should also push that, and perhaps in connection with your work seems to me a very promising thing. But one thing about just to know your opinion on that. So as you nicely mentioned, Maria Silvia and I have worked a model in which phronesis has priority over the individual virtues. That we think the priority is conceptual, ontological, and even ontogenetical. And I think that this gives to phronesis a more, I think, also credible view. Because if one starts like Miller with the individual virtues, at first it's clear, right? You know what is honesty, you know what is generosity, and blah, blah, blah. But then every time there is a conflict, what happens there? And if you reverse the thing, I think, moral life can be explained much better. So because there is, the traditional idea that lives just out there that, what has priority. Miller that says that individual virtues have priority. In our view, that Phronesis is the real basis of our moral lives. What do you think of that? I don't know exactly how you stand in this debate.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm probably closer to you than to Miller. I mean, obviously, both what Miller says and Lapsley on the one hand and what you and Maria say on the other hand, I mean, these sort of basically, in a way, challenge the neo-Aristotelian conception from different angles. I think Miller is wrong. I mean, I don't think Miller necessarily means that it's all about the individual virtues. He seems to leave space also for the possibility that the individual functions somehow operate separately. I think he is making a mistake similar to somebody who said, I mean, there is no special philosophy of decathlon. There is just a philosophy of, you know, a training regime for the 10 sports that decathlon incorporates, but that's completely wrong. I mean, decathlon has got its own, you know, way of training, and it requires a lot of trade-offs between different virtues. Like when you are training speed, it can affect, you know, the training for the shot put and so on. So there is a whole sort of philosophy and psychology of how to train decathlon as an Olympic sport. It can't just be used to the individual sports or the individual techniques. I think Miller is not really correct about this. Now, Bob McGrath, I mean, has another similar view. So Bob McGrath believes that everything that we want to say about phronesis can be said within the 24 character strengths and virtues, the Peterson and Seligman system, just by combining the functions of 3 of the 24, namely prudence, perspective, and judgment. But that sort of just moves the problem to another level. I mean, what happens if there's a conflict between one of those? And I do actually think that the main mistake, the main failure or weakness in the Peterson and Seligman system is that there is no meta virtue at all. It's just a collection of 24 different strengths, and just the more is the better. So this is what I would say about the criticism from that side. So I agree with you. I think I agree with you completely about how to respond to that. Now, you sort of come from the other side and say, well, actually, maybe the neo-Aristotelian conception of phronesis is not too broad. It's actually too narrow, because I mean, it should actually incorporate phronesis as the virtue with a capital V, right? You don't need the rest if you got phronesis. So, like I said, I mean, I find this alternative more appealing than Miller's or Lapsley's or McGrath's, but I would have certain sort of concerns about it, and I think probably we would need much more time to discuss those. But first of all, I worry that it paints a slightly unrealistic picture of the moral psychology of the virtuous person, because I do think very few people possess phronesis, but many people, which we would call virtuous, I mean, are quite strong on various individual virtues. But where they fail is if there's a conflict, but we would still say overall that the person is a good person, is a virtuous person, although this element of phronesis is missing. And this is particularly an issue with like children, because Aristotle does talk about virtue in the context of children as well, especially in the rhetoric. But obviously children by definition do not have phronesis, but we could still say that this is a very grateful child or a generous child, or etc. So I worry slightly about this aspect of phronesis. So like, it's almost like you're saying that only the decathlonist is the true athlete, because I mean, he is the one who combines all these kinds of expertise together in one sport. But what about the guy who's just really good at running? And you know, in most cases, because most of what he's doing on a daily basis is running, then I mean, he is really good at that. Is it only the phronimos who is the virtuous person? That's basically my concern. And then obviously it also connects to what I was saying about the civic virtues and phronesis. If it's true that if we believe Aristotle that you can have the civic virtues fully, if you're not a ruler, without phronesis, then that seems to be a challenge to your thesis, unless your thesis is only about the virtuous person as a morally virtuous person, but not as a sort of politically or civically virtuous person. And the third problem, I mean, I don't want to spend all the time talking about this, but the third issue I have would be about motivation. So this theory seems to indicate that the motivation for virtue comes mainly from phronesis itself, or from your moral identity as a whole. But I actually do think that when we are faced with a dilemma, that the real motivation comes from the individual virtues. So even in the case of the friend who comes with an address to me and I'm wondering whether to be honest or compassionate, I think that the motivation that is driving me is mainly the motivation coming from the virtues of honesty and compassion. And phronesis is trying to sort of mitigate and reconcile these, but if it's just phronesis, I mean, if virtue is just phronesis, then where does the motive, what is the motivation then? Is it just being a good virtuous person that sort of motivates everything you do? I'm not sure that, again, that's a realistic picture of moral psychology, which I think is much more complex and multifaceted regarding motivation. But I mean, we could spend a whole, afternoon or
yes,
talking about this. But like I said, I'm definitely closer to your alternative than I am to the Miller, McGrath, or Lapsley fragmentation view.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Sofia Bonicalzi.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. I would have a question about your proposed intervention, especially in schools and the military, etc. And in particular, with reference to what you said about the wisdom of crowd and the collective phronesis. So my question will be more or less, what is the specific role that you attribute to discussion, and what exactly you expect from that? Because it seems that from research in moral psychology, we know that when people come together and decide on moral grounds, sometimes they do not decide for the good, and phenomena such as diffusion of responsibility or social loafing that is studied in business ethics or moral disengagement may also happen. So my question would be, how do you expect the discussion to have a very positive role on what exactly do you expect from that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I do think Aristotle is very unrealistic. I mean, if you in the politics, when he talks about, a crowd being less likely to fall prey to a strong, aberrant emotion on an individual, actually, he doesn't know much about the psychology of crowds, because unfortunately, contemporary research indicates completely the opposite. So I agree with you that, I mean, in a way, groups are maybe even more likely to come to a collective wrong decision because of strong emotions that get spread around the whole group. But to return to your question, so our measure of phronesis and our intervention both for high schools and for professionals was actually sort of done basically just in light of Aristotle's model in the Nicomachean Ethics. Before we started to look at, or I started to look at collective phronesis. So my research into collective phronesis in the politics hasn't yet informed any of our practical work in the Jubilee Center. What I can say though is, and that relates to discussion and critical dialogue, it is really incredible that when people complain about Aristotle being very reticent about any methods of phronesis development in the Nicomachean Ethics, they miss, I think, what he talks about as what I think is the main method of phronesis development. Nobody writes about this nowadays in character education. The main method of phronesis development is friendship, as I read the Nicomachean Ethics. It's no coincidence that the longest chapter in the Nicomachean Ethics is about friendship. And a lot of it is educational and developmental. And a lot of it is about sort of, people who are not perfect in character, but or developing character, coming together and discussing and helping each other out and through some critical dialogue. And I do think it's no coincidence that nobody is interested in friendship as a method of moral education. When I publish papers, if I publish something about friendship, nobody cites it. It's just no interest whatsoever in psychological or philosophical circles in friendship as a method of character education. Absolutely zero interest. And I think it's perhaps because we have completely lost this idea of critical friendship. We've completely lost the idea that teenagers come together in order to discuss moral dilemmas, in order to criticize each other, in order to help each other out to become better persons. Our contemporary notion of friendship is just about getting as many likes from our friends as we possibly can on Facebook. So I do have a great belief in discussions as a method of people who are friends or classmates or peers coming together and helping each other out on the way to virtue. But it doesn't seem to be a method that resonates either with academics or with teachers in the contemporary climate. And my guess is as good as yours about why that is the case.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a question, another question. Maria Silvia Vaccarezza, please.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much, Kristján, for the presentation. And your work on Phronesis inspired much of our work too. So that was great to hear your account from your voice here in this setting where we can discuss together. And of course, you're right that we could discuss for a whole night about which one is the right interpretation of Phronesis. But I'd like you to, I wanted to push you a little bit more on something you said right at the beginning when you discussed many places where Phronesis is used, academically speaking, and in different areas. And at the beginning, you said that many of these uses have nothing to do with the moral as Aristotle conceived it. So since this is a question that has been raised because yesterday I was reading Kristján Swanton's last book on target-centered virtue ethics, and she challenged the idea that, once again, it's not the first time, and she's not the first one to do that, that we really can draw a sharp division between the moral and the non-moral as we understand this field now in Aristotelian terms. So, and she recovers the notion of the practical as a huger area which encompasses many aspects. And that's striking because when you read Aristotle, one of the best examples he finds for Phronesis is medicine, so a techne, as it were. So what's the relation in your account between the moral and the non-moral, and can we really draw this kind of sharp division between the domain of the moral and other practical or technical or non-strictly moral in contemporary terms domains? So that would be the first question. And secondly, you were kind of skeptical towards the view which has Phronesis as a sort of eye on the particular case in a kind of extremely particularized fashion. And so I'd like you to tell us more about the perceptual ability of Phronesis, because I guess, I know you think there is a perceptual ability within Phronesis, but so which kind of eye or perceptual capacity or ability is it, if it's not to be understood in those terms you criticized at the beginning?
No, the second question is sort of fairly simple. Obviously moral perception, or what we call the constitutive function, is one of the components in our model. And it's, I would say, sort of, if we look at it temporally speaking, then that's probably what happens first. I mean, it's the same with the emotions, that the first thing which happens, you see something, you notice something, and you immediately conceptualize it in light of the concepts that we have at your disposal. This is why virtue literacy is so important for young kids, just to know what virtue terms mean, because then they see things differently. They see gratitude, they see generosity, which they wouldn't do if they don't know the concept. So, I mean, I'm not trying to undermine or underestimate the value of the perceptive part of phronesis, but I'm just saying that the postmodernists, I mean, or at least certain kind of postmodernists to write about this, even really bright people like Joseph Dunn, they sort of just basically end there, and then what happens is there is no blueprint of the good life, there is no theory in the background, there is no flourishing, there is no eudaimonia, there is just, you know, this insight and some kind of tacit knowledge, or you know, an aha moment which happens. Oh, right, you just notice in a flash what's the right thing to do. And I mean, yeah, I mean, maybe it's true, maybe that's what happens, but that's not Aristotelian theory, at least we believe that. The first question is very, very complex, and I don't really know how much time I've got to talk about it. Obviously, you're quite right. I mean, there is no concept of the moral in Aristotle. I mean, there is a very famous sentence, obviously, in Anscombe's 58 Modern Moral Philosophy article, where it talks about anybody who uses the word moral and is talking about Aristotle, his jaws will lock or something. He won't be able to close his mouth. So it's quite funny. But anyway, obviously he talks about the ethical, and the ethical has to do with moral character and so on. Now, neo-Aristotelians, I mean, obviously use the word moral because it's just a standard term in moral psychology and moral education, moral philosophy. And they often use it in a fairly broad sense, I mean, broader than just having to do with ethical character. And I don't have any issues with that as such, but we should be mindful that Aristotle does draw a distinction between phronesis and techne, and he draws it for a very good reason. The people who are so eager to expand the sphere of phronesis to include techne, various kinds of techne, they are so eager because they think this gives them a chance to explain the uncodifiability of various practices, which are not, strictly speaking, ethical or even moral, except in a very, very broad sense. Obviously, if you're a cancer doctor and you have to find the best, you know, mixture of cancer drugs for a patient with pancreatic cancer, it's a moral decision in the sense of having to do with the well-being of the person, but that's moral in an extremely broad, you know, and bloated sense. But it's nothing to do with ethical character as such. It's just a technical solution. What people miss is that there are, in my view, two concepts of techne in Aristotle. There is the sort of official concept where it's all codifiable, and you just find a recipe for a chocolate cake in a book, and then you sort of follow it and you make the cake, and the value lies only in the cake, not in the process, and blah, blah, blah. But he also gives various examples of techne which is not codifiable in this way. I mean, he talks about the army general and the medical doctor and etc. So, and the captain of a ship as well. So I think these people who are so eager to expand the notion of phronesis and often use McIntyre as their basis, I think they could say everything they wanted to say in a much clearer way just by using Aristotle's sort of second techne concept. It's uncodifiable, but it's nothing to do with ethical character, and it's nothing really to do with the moral either, except if you just use moral in such a broad sense that it doesn't really mean anything anymore.
Thank you very much. We have another, probably last question, Michelle Croce. Oh, okay, sorry, I have to unmute you.
Yes, now it works. Thanks, Kristján. I think I have a very kind of a quick question. I was wondering whether you could expand a little bit more on the kind of disagreement you have with Nancy Snow about the blueprint aspect, and in particular, if I understood right, that you seem to have different views because Nancy thinks that the blueprint aspect wouldn't work in a liberal pluralistic world. I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more, because I mean, my worry, or the kind of intuition I have sometimes, is that we ask Phronesis to do too much, maybe, and I mean, a slightly slimmer notion would be more operational in some circumstances, and especially when it comes to political engagement and stuff like that. So just an opportunity for you to say something more on that. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I won't be able to say as much as probably you would want, because I've only basically very quickly skimmed through the chapter by Snow on this. I thought this chapter was just derived from her book, which I have read, you know, the new book with Warren and Wright. But actually, this chapter says quite a bit more than the book does. So I need to read it more carefully. We try to avoid, with the blueprint component, a very very substantive and detailed account of eudaimonia, which is sometimes referred to as a grand end view. So the blueprint view is vaguer than that. It's not really sort of a grand end view which sort of determines once and for all, I mean, all the sort of the contours of flourishing life. So by a blueprint, we sort of mean much more just what psychologists would call the moral identity, so the general identity of what kind of a person you want to be, and what are your main objectives in life. So it's less rigid than the grand end view, and I thought actually it would suffice to sort of satisfy liberals, because I mean, obviously there's a quite a leverage to fill in the variables in moral identity with various different views of the good life. But Nancy and her colleagues in this chapter seem to think that even this sort of fairly watered down version of the grand end view, the blueprint view, is still too determinate for contemporary consumption, and that we need something which is more flexible and sort of more open to interpretation, both by different cultures and possibly by different individuals as well. But I just need to really read this much more carefully, this chapter, before I can give you a satisfactory answer, and I plan to do so in the near future.
Thank you. There is a last question by Angelo Campodonico. So if you can keep maybe your question and maybe also your answer quick, we will have saved a few minutes. Thank you.
I think you need to unmute him. Yep.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Kristján. Perhaps the question is connected with that of Michelle, but I have not read the book of Nancy or the article. But my question concerns the topic of flourishing in the liberalism milieu. No? What do you think that we have to, because the topic of flourishing is very important, because if you don't have an idea of flourishing, you don't have motivation, and you have not phronesis, not so. What do you think that we have to, for instance, we need a wider concept of flourishing, or we need perhaps to use different concepts of flourishing in the different milieu? I think that, can you say something more about the topic of flourishing in liberal society? This is my main question.
Yeah, well, thank you, Angela. So, well, I've written a whole book about flourishing. It came out in 2020, and again, I mean, it's a huge topic. I mean, my main worry about the flourishing concept, which again is yeah, well, even more popular than the Phronesis concept, and now has even been taken up by OECD. And as you may know, I mean, OECD is planning to incorporate a flourishing measure in its PISA comparisons of school systems. So flourishing is going to be a huge topic of debate in education in the next few years when that is published. But the problem with the discourse on flourishing in education and philosophy is that there are at least four different conceptions of flourishing competing. There is, like you say, the liberal conception, there is the Aristotelian conception, and then there is a different conception from self-determination theory, and then there's a fourth one from positive psychology from Martin Seligman and his group. And all these four conceptions have got the pros and cons. And actually, in my book on flourishing, I do acknowledge that the Aristotelian conception of flourishing needs to be modified in light of especially contemporary psychological insights. But I do worry about the liberal conception, and I'm thinking about it here in terms of its educational incarnation in works by people like Harry Brickhouse, John White, sort of the leading educational philosophers of the last decades, who all are liberals. Dorothy Ruyter in the Netherlands as well. I mean, these are really good educational philosophers, I mean, top class, but I do feel that the conception of flourishing that they are promoting is like a shopping trolley that you can fill with your own selection of goods. And there are just too few constraints on it, at least from an Aristotelian standpoint. So I mean, obviously this is a very big topic, and you know, we could spend hours talking about, you know, roles and the idea of, you know, comprehensive theories of the good and whether they are fitting in modern liberal democracies and so on. But I actually think that the liberals in general overestimate the difference of opinion about, for example, moral virtues. I think that the shyness about incorporating other moral virtues and tolerance in their theory is to their own detriment. I mean, if you just look at studies of people all over the world, I mean, in liberal or illiberal societies, I mean, and if you ask them to prioritize the moral virtues, I mean, we get the same lists everywhere. I mean, it's always, is honesty number one and compassion number two, or compassion number one and honesty number two. There is no difference between, you know, religions and cultures and communities. I mean, this is all at the level of political disagreement about economics and stuff. But I think the liberal flourishing theorists are sort of much too shy to acknowledge this, and they just go into Tesco's with their shopping trolley and, you know, fill it with stuff. But there's no constraints on what you put into the trolley, and that worries me.
So thank you very much. I think we are finished. Really, I think that many parts of your talk would deserve an entire presentation themselves. So I personally would have liked to ask you more about the third and the fourth component, but I'm confident I will have, you know, chances to do it very soon. So thank you really so much for your presentation. Thanks a lot.
Can I add one thing, Claudia? I found out nowadays during our daily meeting that Kristján is in Rome every year in this period. So we would like to invite him next year if he tells us a little earlier, even if I don't. Sorry, I didn't say Kristján anymore. And so
I'm here.
If you tell us some advance, we can organize something together in Rome somewhere. There are several. Claudia is in a university, and Sophia and May are in another one, and so we could do something together if you like.
Thank you, Mario, and thank you, Claudia, and thank you for all of you who asked questions and attended this seminar.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot. I saw that Pavlov Kontoso was also raising his hand, but I'm not sure we have time for another question. What do you think, Mario and Maria Silvia, Sophia? Can we?
It's up to Kristján. It's up to Kristján. No, I think it's clapping.
Oh, was it? Sorry, I I misunderstood. Well, I saw the wrong sign. So, okay. So before saying goodbye to all of you, I would just remind. I want to remind our next meeting, which is scheduled next November the 11th of November. And Pavlos Kontos is our next speaker. You will find more information about this in the website. I saw Michelle put the link to the Mind&Ethics website in this chat. So if you want to check also, thank you, Michelle, in the chat. But also in the invitation you have received by email, you can find the websites where you can check. But basically, the title would be experience-based variation of practical wisdom. So practical wisdom again at stake. So I will, I'm looking forward to seeing all of you again next month. And I think we can, just say goodbye and thank you, all of you, for your participation and your attention. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.